Welcome to the next edition of Grid Forward Chats. I'm Bryce Yonker with Grid Forward. Today we have with us Jon Creyts, the CEO of RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, as it was previously known. Today's February 14th. I guess it's still Happy New Year. Thanks for being with us, Jon.
Thanks so much for hosting here today, Bryce.
So can you tell us a little bit about your history? I know you've been at RMI for about a decade, but new to the helm there at the organization. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to that role, and we'll get a little bit into some of the stuff that's at the top of the agenda at RMI. But how about for you?
Yeah, well, I'm a bit of a reformed engineer, a recovering management consultant, and kind of an absolute committed practitioner of the energy transition who made his way to RMI here after a bunch of years in the private sector. And since I've joined RMI, I've really helped build RMI's global presence and build the team really that can practice the think, do, scale model that RMI really embraces to drive the energy transition fully at pace and really capture those benefits that we know are there from using clean and efficient renewables.
Great. Well, congratulations on taking over the role after some big shoes to fill that I know you were excited to work with over the years there. Maybe we'll start with just a quick question about RMI for those who aren't as familiar. What's at the top of the list for you all right now? What are you trying to prioritize? What's a focus for the organization there?
Yeah, for us at RMI, there are a bunch of big things. I think first off is really helping everyone understand where we are in the energy transition. Right, we see that we're at an inflection point. We're about ready to tip in a very significant way the global infrastructure related to clean energy. We know that solar and wind are now cheaper in 95% of the world. That we're driving down the costs of related technologies like batteries, like heat pumps, like hydrogen at scale, and that as all of those different markets align, we're seeing just enormous opportunities emerge, and that markets will change and flip very quickly. So this whole idea of the narrative is one big understanding, just to put that GPS, kind of pin in place for everyone to understand that what has been slow and talked about for a long time is now picking up speed and ready to flip. I think a second big thing that we're absolutely focused on is the Inflation Reduction Act, right? This is the single largest investment in climate infrastructure made anywhere in the world to date. We see it as a massive opportunity for the United States, not just to help secure, kind of its place in the next energy system, but also to lower the costs and increase the availability of all these solutions globally. And so we're focused on ensuring that every ounce of that opportunity is captured. And then the third big thing that I'm concerned about is, I'm an optimist by nature, and I can see a pathway now where we can get half the world to net zero by 2050. But for half the world, it simply isn't possible, right? And we need to figure out how to bring the global south along, because if we don't all cross the finish line together, right, we've fundamentally lost as a planet. We need to have ways to increase the flow of capital, to support technology transfer, to build new markets that allow for that leapfrog to happen and enable, kind of communities in the global south to choose the energy transition that makes the most sense for them.
Great. So the ecosystem of supporting organizations that are involved in accelerating clean energy, helping along for energy transition, advancing technology and market solutions, as you know, is a very robust one. So in general, how would you say that collaboration is going right now? You all are certainly actively involved in it. Is it a good collaboration? Where are there some areas that those of us who are working in this space can really be all rowing in the same direction? What's your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know this well, Bryce, but this is system transformation, right? When we talk about and think about the energy transition right now, we've got to realign our policies, we've got to realign our capital, we've got to realign all the financing structures. And that really does take everyone contributing, and with NGOs like RMI kind of playing an important role in helping to moderate and move the system together. I think we are in the process, right, of transitioning into that new system. And as you would expect, there are fits and starts, as different parts of the economy align. I do think, especially here in the United States, that the power of the Inflation Reduction Act, alongside, kind of all the other acts that have been related, and there are really about 5 of them that have dramatically increased the amount of funding available, right, they have signaled very clearly to the market the direction of travel, and are now kind of providing the stage upon which many of these collaborations are coming to fruition. And RMI is engaged, kind of in many different areas of the country, working on developing and building hubs, together across the financiers and the big industry players, alongside the city councils, to try and take this influx of capacity and turn it into real forward motion and progress with steel in the ground. And that, those are areas where, again, we're just learning to pass the ball differently, to play as teams, as the United States kind of rebuilds the muscle of large infrastructure development and execution.
Great. Well, that tees up my next question, which was around the federal policy aspects. I said 3 home runs in 2020, 2021, and 2022. I think I know what the 2 others you might throw in there are, but we think it really got started with the Energy Act of 2020, the Infrastructure Investment Act in 2021, the IRA in 2022. I assume you're putting chips in there and something else, but these are basically increasing levels of funding going to advancing our energy systems. And my question would be, what are the next few years of implementation going to look like?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Bryce. I added chips in there. I would also add, kind of the American Rescue Plan, right? The one that kicked it off here in terms of providing public infrastructure funds and public transit funds. And when you add all those up together, you wind up, putting roughly $110 billion a year into the U.S. economy every year for the next decade into clean energy projects and clean energy development. And it's a massive surge, right, compared to what we've had historically, more than 5 times, kind of our historical levels from a decade ago. And so as we think about, kind of what's in store and what we need to do well, I think about 3 big things, right? First, we need to make sure that we expand the markets, right? We need to make sure that these incentives actually turn into market demand and grow the product distribution for all the EVs, all the heat pumps, all the hydrogen electrolyzers, all these different components that we're going to need here going forward. So there's that element of how do we convert what is just a financial signal into real market growth and development. Secondly, there is this question around supply chain and how do we build a resilient supply chain, kind of not just in the United States, but amongst our partners and globally, right, that can support, kind of all the lithium that we need, all the nickel and copper and other metals that we'll need to fuel the energy transition here, and ensure that we've got that, again, that diversified support base that allows not just our economy, but all economies to grow. And then third, related to that is this is a great moment for jobs creation. Fossil fuels, you get roughly 2.5 jobs per $1 million invested. With renewables, you get 6 to 7 jobs. So this is a jobs, kind of moment of creation here, and an ability to repopulate and shift, kind of whole sectors to support now this clean energy growth is a real opportunity for us, and one where we can modernize our workforce and provide more good, high-paying jobs to all, even as we transition to this much-needed kind of alternative infrastructure.
Great. I know that a lot of the runway of the infrastructure package has about 5 years, and the Inflation Reduction Act has about 10. So let's put ourselves out in the future, 5 or 10 years from now, talking about getting the structures and the mechanisms in place to get these resources out there. But what sort of metrics are we pleased about if we've achieved? I don't know if it's a monetary level, but what does success look like as we look out to the future with these resources in motion?
Yeah, I mean, we go back to the fundamental science here, Bryce, and say we've got to reduce our overall emissions by 50% here by the end of this decade to be on track to net zero by 2050 if we really want to become climate aligned. And so those are the big metrics, and we can talk about it. It means that the majority of our grid needs to be decarbonized here by 2035, because that electrification then provides the fuel essentially for our electrified automobiles and our electrified buildings and our electrified industry to the extent that that's possible. And where we can't electrify industry, we need to have electrolyzers, to make hydrogen and other green molecules that allow us to have, fuels that enable our heavy transport to happen. We need to create sustainable aviation fuel, and other derivatives that allow us, again, to have the fuel to power our economy. And we have an effort called Mission Possible Partnership that literally has, for each one of the major categories of infrastructure, the number that we need to have in place by 2030, and route to net zero by 2050 of these new plants of the new production capacity. But I would think in general about the grid's got to shift first, and we've got to do everything possible on that front, which means, getting the solar and wind out there, getting the storage out there in all different forms. We see clear momentum right now on electric vehicles, and know that market can tip very quickly here. And certainly it's leading on the passenger front, but we also see ways to move heavy vehicles as well as light duty and have more diversified 2- and 3-wheeled options here going forward too, that will play an important and niche role in community access and ensuring, again, that this great moment of freedom from fossil fuels also democratizes access to mobility and affordable energy in the process, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll do one more on the federal policy front before we go to some other topics. Our audience and our work has been very close to what's been going on in the infrastructure package, especially with Maria and Pat's office at the new Grid Deployment Office. So feel welcome to comment on that if you'd like, but I guess I'm going to point your attention towards the IRA and what key elements of that are in motion now. Where are they? When should we expect kind of some developments?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the IRA and where it is right now, there's, there are things that we already know how to do, right? The solar tax credit, storage investment tax credit, things like that. We've already got the infrastructure in place. We know how to qualify electric vehicles. We largely know how to manage. Those are all moving forward apace, right? And access is either here or will be soon available, to large portions of the market. Where we're building out new standards and new, options, things like hydrogen, there's still some big rules that have to be determined on that front that are actually quite material to infrastructure plans and expectations and returns from investors, et cetera. That's going to lag here substantially. In between, we've got, some of the consumer electronics and demands, things like electric stoves, heat pumps, et cetera. They're somewhere in the middle, right? And we hope that they'll be available by the end of this year in terms of accessibility for people to manage and apply for and gain those tax credits, right? And 2/3 of the structure here was around incentivizing through tax credits, right? So we have to keep in mind that that's a big, kind of the big stick that was used, or the big carrot that was used, I should say, by the federal government. Some of the tricky areas that we're certainly monitoring and looking at are around, the big infrastructure, the grid. How exactly do we debottleneck transmission, right? And there is, absolutely, kind of a loan program embedded in there for large scale transmission. There's a grant program there as well for communities that wouldn't otherwise benefit from transmission overhead. Those are, I think, those loans and ability to deploy will be there. I think we have to queue up the requests first. And right now we've got a real issue around, kind of pluggage in the system on overall, kind of interconnections, right? Where the interconnection queue right now is, from a capacity perspective, is almost as big as the entire grid that we have currently in place, right? And then we have one that's about half that size in terms of battery storage as well. So we're not keeping up with the infrastructure demand right now in terms of having permitting processes and supporting processes that then can, kind of get these projects on the fast track and ultimately moving toward FID and beyond, right? And that is something that we, need to put more attention to and brutally debottleneck so that we can rise to the challenge. There is no 50% or 45% reduction in our overall carbon emissions here by 2030 if we can't get that grid expanded and permitted and constructed in a way that supports, kind of much higher penetrations of renewable.
Great. I think you covered almost all of the aspects from a grid enhancing standpoint we were covering. So our vantage point tends to be a little bit closer with the distribution utilities and the advanced tech companies that they're working with to bring new solutions to the grid. And I know this is an area that you have worked with very closely over the years, whether it's blockchain and virtual power. So I guess I'll start with the broader question before we get into the details. How do you feel that the interest and real practical ability for these operators to advance these new solutions, where does that land in the industry right now? Is there the commitment to accelerate these solutions? Is that baked into the models and operating practices of these? Do things realign or change so that these capabilities can come on and do what they're intended to do for the system?
Yeah. So this is an area of innovation and challenge, I would say, for the existing system. The commitment and willingness is certainly there for utilities and kind of the core grid operators. And 83% of the U.S. customers, today are served by a utility with a carbon reduction target or owned by a holding company with a clear carbon reduction target. And so there's absolutely the desire to get there. The practical aspect of how to do that, though, is challenging, right? And that's not just because it's utilities. It's challenging because it's new, right? And change and how exactly to catch up, kind of our operations and approaches to integration of all these new different resources that we have is complex, right? And that's something that RMI has been working on for years, helping to pilot and work alongside utilities to both learn new muscles, to create new regulatory structures that incentivize in the right way, to practically demonstrate, kind of where and how diverse distributed energy resources can be plugged into the system and actually create value for both customer and utility simultaneously, right? It's not easy, but it is possible, and we've showcased that again and again. And I know, from our perspective, the time is ripe to start pulling together more of these distributed energy resources and to create portfolios of solutions that we call virtual power plants, right? that start to provide predictable power, both in supply and resiliency for communities, and to really incorporate them as planning units within the overall grid of the future, right? And so we've been working very closely with utilities on that. We actually announced a partnership here just last month with a host of leading entities, including some of the tech companies and folks like Google, alongside automobile companies like GM and Ford, alongside some of the distributed renewables players like SunPower and Sunrun, and kind of are starting to navigate the complexities of how do you build up, the business model, the regulatory structures, the approaches that allow these resources to all be integrated effectively in. And the curious thing was that after announcement there, we were, kind of approached by multiple utilities that all wanted to participate as well and understand how they could collaborate and work within this ecosystem, because they see it very much as an unknown or an area that they need to learn in order to innovate and support what their customers are going to demand going forward, right?
Absolutely. It's very exciting. VP3, I think you guys are calling it. And I know it's early days for the initiative, but is there a level of confidence or enthusiasm around the scale that these solutions can come to market and the sort of impact that they can have? Just for example, it seemed like they did have material impact last summer in California, although that was those were razor thin margins. And if, maybe we were a degree or two hotter, maybe it wouldn't have been able to suffice. Is there any kind of initial thought as to how these solutions can meet the moment of the day?
Yeah, I mean, of course, RMI always starts with framing the big opportunity, and when we look at it, we see in the near term, right, by 2030, we could likely harness about 60 gigawatts of capacity out there that's just latent in the system right now, that could be used and dispatched to solve issues like what came up in California, right? And that we could grow that potentially threefold by 2050. Right, so this is a sizable resource that's out there that can and should be incorporated in. When we think about the specifics of California, right, it was indeed demand response and kind of some of the DER calling there that absolutely made the difference and kept the California grid from crashing last September, right? And that's a good thing. It shows the power of when we can use air conditioners or EV chargers or air conditioners and automate or have some system for dispatching them, we can get a significant response. In the same moment, right, I think it's also clear that everyone who participated there, none of them got paid for it, right? And while utilities were getting paid, for supplying, there was a response and a service that was provided that wasn't properly, kind of compensated in the process. And we need to figure out how we incorporate, right, this large scale resource into wholesale markets, right? And that's part of the reform process that needs to happen here. Now, RMI, as you mentioned blockchain, we've been working here for about 6 or 7 years now on blockchain applications, specifically using decentralized computing to run a decentralized grid. And we have a spin out called the Energy Web Foundation that actually ran some of the algorithms and approaches to identify customers in California that were called upon in that emergency. The interesting thing, though, is that while it could have been automated, the CalISO preferred not to automate it at this time, right? Preferred only to protect information and to have the data double blinded and kind of ensure that the resource could be accessed without violating privacy, rather than creating an automated system that could actually animate the market and provide this real-time exchange of value at the same time that it balances the grid. I think that's something that's doable right now, where the technology exists.
Great. So just a couple more minutes here. Maybe we'll pull out. I know you and I are sitting here in the West, in the US, but you've had lots of experience in China or recently back from COP. and RMI touches aspects of energy transition across the globe. I guess my question here would be, with the volatility in Europe and energy markets seeming to react somewhat violently to the news of the day, is this more of the same? Should we be expecting this volatility in the near term? Does it come along with the energy transition that we're working through, or is it somewhat a reflection of the geopolitics happening today? I know there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, this is where I'd pull us back a bit, Bryce, and just think about where we are in the energy transition. And with any commodity, right, whether it be the transition from horses to automobiles, or the transition from gas street lights to electric street lights, you see this process of growth, right, of a peak and then a plateau that somewhat bounces around, and then an imminent decline that happens, right? And based on RMI's analysis that has now been validated by the IEA as well as BP 2 weeks ago, we've seen that we actually peaked fossil fuel consumption here in 2019, right? Globally, as a planet, we peaked our overall fossil fuel use. Now, there are still different areas of the world where there's still growth, but places like Europe peaked back in early 2000s. The United States peaked in the late, just before 2010, and now we're seeing China very near the peak right now. This process, right, this process of chaotic markets globally, especially around oil and gas right now, is certainly being induced by the tragedy of Ukraine and what exactly has happened in that completely unjust war, right? But the response that we're seeing is indicative of this top level. We've peaked and we're at a plateau where markets are trying to understand direction before the clear downward slide. And what we know right now is that in total on the planet, we are adding more new energy through renewables, through solar and wind right now and other forms of renewables, than we are growing load, right? Then we're growing demand overall. And so that means that, that peak has come, and it's only going to go faster as we add more and more capacity and supply. So as we think about, what IRA has done, or the Inflation Reduction Act, what Repower Europe has done and their follow-on work, what hydrogen mission in India, what Japan's response, what all of these, responses to the immediate, near-term conflict in Europe have resulted in, is just sped that decline faster down and ensured that the transition will happen. It will happen at pace and scale. And now markets are coming to terms with that in this last bout of volatility before, the stranded assets start driving the decline even faster and make the financial returns more challenging.
All right, 2 more questions and then we'll wrap. You mentioned earlier the jobs that are inherently created along the energy transition. I think you were probably citing some figures specific to renewables and efficiency, but in general, the energy community is much in need of talent right now. So I think my question would be, how can the collective how can those that are working around energy bring the right diverse talent pool that is needed for the job at hand right now?
Yeah, I would say, one, that there's absolutely a real constraint right now on talent and capacity, and we need to build up that capacity through all different forms of education and recruitment. I will say as well, though, that there's been an unexpected surge here in transitions from folks who were on the fossil fuel side of the business, wanting to shift over and support the renewables and the evolution of sustainable energy. Bloomberg had coined the phrase climate quitters, right, as being kind of emblematic of that there are those who are kind of quitting their jobs to join companies and organizations that are working to solve this crisis that we're in. And we at RMI have certainly seen many transition over to support us in the process. And in that article that Bloomberg called this out, one of our own leaders, Joe Daniel, was mentioned, who worked originally for Baker Hughes and realized that he could take the same policy knowledge that he was using in the oil and gas space and transition over to support, kind of the clean energy transition. And that's one example. I think there is significant opportunity here, but I'm most encouraged right now that we'll solve this by just the sheer volume of youth that are being engaged and the demands that they have, both to be involved, but also for their companies, wherever they sign up, to really support this energy transition and to acknowledge and respect, kind of the requirement for sustainability as a real and motivating force for industry here going forward.
All right. So our closing question is a big one. So take it where you'd like. Our audience is mostly working around advancing the functionality of the grid by bringing modernization onto the system and scaling it. So I guess I'll close with, what role does the grid itself, whether you want to talk macro or micro or something in between, transmission, distribution, take it wherever you'd like. What role does the grid play in the larger scene of decarbonization and more broadly for the changing climate that we're all working to deal with?
Yeah, the grid is the essential enabler of the energy transition. The prospect of coming into climate alignment can only be done if we can harness this immense, kind of an incredibly low cost potential of renewables. And if we're going to be successful in doing that, we need to connect those renewables to the end uses, right? To provide people with the warm showers and the cold beer that they need to ensure that, kind of industries have the energy that's required to produce all of the construction material, kind of goods that we use and need as a planet. And so, kind of that essential role is, kind of one without which the energy transition simply can't happen. And if we don't speed, kind of our support of the grid and its evolution here, we're going to wind up falling short of our aspiration and our need to align, ultimately, kind of our real economy with the constraints of the planet. And we can't afford that. So we've got to build a stronger grid. We've got to automate it and make use of all the resources out there. And we've got to, kind of ultimately find ways to get ourselves out of the way of some of the permitting and siting issues and speed the pathway toward, building that grid that we so desperately want and need at this moment of crisis.
Well, Jon, thank you for the insights. Good luck on all the exciting and important endeavors, and we look forward to collaborating ahead.
Thanks, Bryce. Pleasure to join you here today.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Grid Forward Chats. If you're interested in Grid Forward membership and our work to accelerate grid modernization and energy innovation, including the backlog of our podcast, visit us at gridforward.org. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and colleagues and give us a rating on your favorite podcast app.